Yeah. Okay, good. So now we are recording. I want to start by sharing a screen of, what is it? This one. Welcoming you to this, our fifth Zoom lecture of the semester, but not the last one. Stick around or come back in June, please, for our next event with Eva Kite, who is with us today. She will be presenting at least a chapter from her book, Learning from My Daughter. I'm not sure what the plan will be exactly. She may, she'll probably talk about her book generally. Amber Knight's gonna comment on it. We were going to try and do the thing like we did with Asha's book and make Eva's book available to everyone, but Oxford apparently couldn't quite do that. So what we can do is make a chapter available to everyone, and if your library has Oxford, the Oxford Library Online, you can get the whole text there. And they also and I'll distribute this. They sent me a flyer that gives you 30% off on the book, which actually makes it pretty reasonable. I think the book is like $24 with the discount. So, it's much cheaper than, say, like my books tend to sell for, So anyway, it's within range. Okay, I hope I'm not keeping anyone in a waiting room right now. And then we're going to keep things going next year, I hope. We'll see how things go. By then, I hope, probably things will be more in person. And so maybe people will be, exhausted with Zoom and won't want to do these things anymore. But we'll see. I've talked to Virginia Held, and she's going to do a presentation on October 15th. And I'm trying to set up some other, possible dates. So we'll see what happens. But I'll keep you all posted. I'll send out emails, and we'll try to keep things going as long as there's some kind of interest in holding these kinds of events. Today, though, turning our attention to today's presenter, we're lucky to have with us Sarah Lucas, who is from the Department of Politics at the University of Exeter. She's actually here with me in Houston. That's where I am, where she is a visiting scholar with the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership at the University of Houston. This is the outfit that I'm the director of, and that has been the institutional sponsor for this Zoom lecture series this year. I've started talking to Sarah, like last summer about this, that she was coming to Houston, and we started to talk about a visiting appointment in the Elizabeth Rockwell Center, and we got things all set up, and then the pandemic went on and on and on, and it got pushed back and pushed back. So Sarah actually just arrived this last Monday. So she's still getting over a little bit of jet lag, but I think seems to be doing well. Anyway, Sarah's research focuses on feminist agency, identity formation, communication, and political action, all of which are plainly on display in today's paper, The Genius of Feminism, Cavelian Moral Perfectionism, and Feminist Political Theory, which, by the way, I really enjoyed, and I'm eager to start talking about. So with that, let me just say, Professor Lucas will talk for 15, 20 minutes, something, to kind of summarize, remind us of the main themes from her paper. We'll then launch directly into questions and discussion. And we'll go as long as there are, questions and discussions to be had. I'm going to have to step away at 1:30 today. So I can keep things going if you all want to stay, but we'll kind of probably plan to end by then. Per usual with these sorts of things, if you have a question, please go to the chat and just write, I have a question, or it doesn't have to be a question, right? It can be a comment. You just want to jump in the discussion to keep things a little bit orderly, and then I'll call on people in order, and we'll just go down the line. But of course, as always happened with these things too, if you want to make a brief comment, you can just kind of jump in at some point too. Anyway, let me now pass things over to Professor Lucas, who will be telling us about the genius of feminism.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, for having me. I'm so excited to be here in Houston, finally, my first time here since 2019, in which time I've had a baby, who's finally getting to spend time with my family. So it's really a dream come true. I'm really ecstatic to be here. And I'm also really excited to be part of this group, which is like super intimidating in a really good way. But Dana was like, do you want to present a paper? And I was like, oh, to your department? No, to every famous care ethicist in the world. Oh, great. So, you know, I'm a little like, yeah, you guys are an interesting audience, a great audience. I'm so excited. I'm so excited that this is my audience. But be kind. Anyway, I'm relatively new to care ethics, but my work has kind of been moving in that direction for a long time. And as Daniel said, it's mostly focused on the concept of agency. And I'm currently on my first ever research leave, and in the middle of the kind of vexing process of turning my PhD dissertation into a book. And in the book, I'm kind of working on an argument for a rehabilitation of narrative agency in feminist theory. So I argue for kind of like an understanding of narrative selfhood that sees the self as both relational and unique. And it's really important to me to keep both of those things in our view as we talk about selfhood. But one of the many things that I keep getting stuck on is the question of ethical subjectivity. Like, in what sense should we understand selves to be ethical? And this is a really fraught question, I'm sure you know, in feminist political theory. And since the ethical turn in political theory, as Ella Myers argues, political theorists have largely pursued two kinds of answers to this question: ethics as a matter of care for the self, after Foucault, and ethics as a matter of care for the other, after Levinas. Myers argues in her excellent book that neither of these ways of thinking about ethics gives due attention to the importance of the things we hold in common. So attention to care for the world. And I think she's right. But I think that caring for the world involves caring as a self. So not necessarily caring for the self, but caring as a self. So enter this paper, which is really long and has a lot going on. And I feel like it's actually speaking from within the brackets of Asha's book last week. She was like, I'm going to bracket all this stuff. And I'm like, well, here, let me open up the brackets. And that's where we're going in this paper. But it has a lot going on. And this is the first draft. I started writing it in February. So really, thank you if you took the time to read it. I started reading Stanley Cavell in a graduate seminar at the University of Sydney. And like a lot of people, I didn't know what to do with him for a long time. But I went to the 2017 WPSA, which I know a lot of you were there. And I went to the roundtable on Andrew Norris's book on Cavell, which turned out to be a manel with an almost entirely male audience. And it struck me that the uptake of Cavell is really kind of bizarrely gendered. On the one hand, you have male political theorists like Tracy Strong, Thomas Dunn, Andrew Norris, who are at pains to explain how and why Cavell, who has been at times seen as a somewhat apolitical philosopher, is important to political theory. But on the other hand, you have a bunch of feminists from a variety of disciplines reading Cavell's work in ordinary language philosophy as a way to help make women's lives intelligible. So it kind of bothered me that these lines of interpretation didn't cross. So I've tried here to kind of cross them. And I suggest that political theorists reading Cavell underappreciate the extent to which his work is aligned with feminist theory. And I suggest that feminists reading Cavell might benefit from increased attention to his writing on Emersonian moral perfectionism, which is not an attachment to any kind of teleology or specific set of virtues, but is basically the idea that we have to try to be better versions of ourselves while at the same time recognizing that this is a never-ending project. So I'm not really completely sure why feminists have ignored this aspect of Cavell, apart from the understandable unease that feminist theorists feel around stuff that smacks of individualism, as moral perfectionism may seem at first to do. But as I understand him, Cavell gives us a way to think about the mutual constitution of self and community that radically rejects conventional understandings of the individual. Moreover, the idea that we need to be ethical selves is all over everyday feminist activism, I think, especially in online spaces. So there's an increased attention across those spaces to individual accountability, authenticity, and mutual recognition between like just real people. So it seems really important to me to pay attention to the question of what it means to approach our lives as ethical selves. So since the paper is long, I'm going to try and summarize it really quickly. I timed the talk yesterday at 16 minutes, but I was talking really quickly because there was a baby crying at my feet. So it might be 20, but well, from now 15. So the paper has three parts. In the first part, I summarize Cavell's importance to politics. So I talk about for him the way in which political and moral life are inextricably interwoven, which is kind of a contentious claim in feminist theory. I don't talk about how contentious it is. We should talk about it in question time. I'm just like, well, this is what I think. And I talk about how community, the mutual constitution of self and community requires that we strive to be better selves in order to achieve our better community. In the second section, I canvass two Cavellian feminisms. The first is Sandra Logier's Ordinary Language Inflected Ethics of Care. And the second is Toro Moy's idea of feminist theory as the reading of particular examples. And in the last section, I try to think through how Cavellian feminism might benefit from increased attention to moral perfectionism. And I also spend an inordinate amount of time reading an Instagram post, which I will not talk about now, but we can talk about in question time. So Cavell and politics. Like all of his work, Cavell's understanding of politics, I'm really intimidated to be giving this with Naomi Sheeman here because she knows so much more about this. But like all his work, Cavell's understanding of politics is grounded in his response to ordinary language philosophy, especially to J.L. Austin and the later Wittgenstein. So for Cavell, the analysis of ordinary language, our everyday use of words, like what we say when, has implications beyond getting to the bottom of what language is doing. It has normative implications. It implicates each of us as language users. So when each of us think about what we say when, we're forced to reckon with the kinds of commitments we make when we participate in language and to consider purposefully and responsibly what we usually do automatically. We're confronted also by the realization that it is only through conversation, this is the contingency thing, with other language users that we are able to create and sustain our political reality. So not through like any kind of recourse to any kind of like metaphysics. And since there's no guarantee that we will understand one another, we have to be receptive to others and to adjust what we say in response to what we learn in conversation with others. So for Cavell, thinking seriously about ordinary language will lead us to acknowledge our words as our own, as he puts it, to mean what we say. And meaning what we say requires that we try to explain ourselves as best we can in order to see whether others see what we see and would say what we would say. So the kinds of conversations that need to happen for us to fully and responsibly mean what we say, Cavell calls moral conversations. And the purpose of these conversations is not to win an argument or to establish the objectively correct conclusion. It's to explore disagreements in order to A, take responsibility for my own point of view, and B, determine whether or not I can respect my interlocutor's point of view. More than this, moral conversations serve to establish and maintain our political communities. In them, we disclose aspects of our own selves and clarify the nature and sustainability of our relationships with others. That is, the extent to which we are able to speak for each other and thus be morally authoritative. In other words, it is by talking through our moral lives, talking out our moral lives, which are messy, complex, conflicted, etc., that we come to understand the extent to which we can speak on behalf of others and the extent to which we are happy to have them speak for us. So to me, there are three really interesting and challenging ideas that come out of Cavell and moral conversations. First, that we have to make ourselves vulnerable in them, in the sense that we have to articulate our own ideas. Two, that we have to care about other people, in the sense that we must be receptive to what they are saying, rather than thinking of it as emblematic of what someone like them would say, or trying to put it, pigeonhole it as, a kind of iteration of some kind of ideology. And then three, that we have to attend to both 1 and 2 in order to sustain our political community. So in this view, and this is a strong claim, I think, we have a political responsibility to pursue the kind of moral thinking that helps us understand who we are as individuals and as a community. So when we speak in the public voice, and I'm doing this now as I wield this we claim community with others we think might understand us, might, as Cavell puts it, see what we see. So this, I think, is where the idea of moral perfectionism comes in. The political responsibility to mean what we say is one that is really often, I think, ignored. It's actually really hard to claim community. Instead, what we do most of the time is exist in a state of conformity, which means we let some impersonal structure stand in for what we ourselves actually think. And this may look like appealing to the authority or tacitly accepting the authority of our academic discipline, our political party, our social movement, and so on. But because it is an abnegation of our responsibility to actively sustain our political community, conformity is an unjust state of affairs. For Cavell, the point is not that impersonal structures like science, philosophy, analytic or continental socialism, republicanism, activism, so on, are not important for helping us systematically understand our shared world. The point is rather that each of us has to do the work of understanding on our own, and this work requires resisting conformity. Resisting conformity is, for Cavell, the crisis of moral perfectionism, and it's often really horrible. So it gives you the feeling, he says, that your own common sense is paradoxical, that either you or the world is wrong. So a favorite example of his for fleshing this out, which he uses a few different times in his work, is Ibsen's A Doll's House, in which Nora leaves her husband Torvald for reasons that are incomprehensible to him and incomprehensible within a society still universally accepting of the institution of patriarchal marriage. Nora doesn't know necessarily exactly what is wrong, like can't articulate exactly what is wrong with patriarchal marriage, but she knows that it is unbearable. So in leaving, she appeals to an imagined community in which this knowledge will be intelligible. And when we, the readers or watchers of the play, recognize her rejection of marriage, which is a resistance to conformity, as just, we may feel ashamed of our failure to resist this injustice ourselves. So we too want to claim a community that takes as a matter of common sense the idea that patriarchy is wrong. And moreover, we want to be selves worthy of such a community. So I guess this is the Cavellian thing I want to say is necessary in feminism, which is like this deep feeling that all is not right with the world. And that has to come from each and every one of us, and it has to be sincerely felt. Feminists who read Cavell, as I said, do not really spend much time on the concept of moral perfectionism, but they usually do offer an account of ethical subjectivity of some kind, with some exceptions that we can talk about in question time. In the paper, I look closely at the work of Sandra Logier and Toro Moy for a couple of reasons. First, because they are arguably the two feminist thinkers most closely aligned with Cavell himself, though both are working in the tradition of ordinary language philosophy more generally. And second, because it seems to me their work is most constructively enhanced by the addition of this idea of moral perfectionism. So for Logier, Cavell's insight that ordinary language philosophy makes an ethical claim on each of us is especially germane to care ethics. So she pursues what she calls an ordinary language inflected ethics of care, which is defined by attention to ordinary life and care for moral expression. And the starting point for her is, as for Cavell, the fragility of both our community, which she calls our form of life after Wittgenstein, and of each member of that community, and that she usually calls voice after both Cavell and Carol Gilligan. The fragility and vulnerability of ordinary life are usually left out of moral philosophy, which is often assured of the authority of its own voice, which is a voice it sort of assumes, it does assume, to be impartial. But Logier argues, drawing on Joan Tronto's work, that paying attention to the ordinary helps shift the center of gravity of ethics from an abstract notion of justice to a sensitivity to what is important. And she talks about all the people. She talks about Simone Weil here and Iris Murdoch and Harry Frankfurt, but really a sensitivity to what is important. So where what is important is what is already there, the ordinary. Who is cleaning the room? Who is listening to a friend in need? Where did this bottle come from? What species of bird is that? It extends beyond interpersonal relations to care for the world. So we come to acknowledge the ordinary in attention to these things, and attention then becomes the first virtue of any kind of ethical pursuit and any kind of philosophical pursuit. So I think that is conducive to this idea of moral perfectionism, because it requires that we begin whatever kind of intellectual work we're doing, or whatever kind of practical work we're doing, with attention, with a virtue of attention. Attention is also a virtue for Toro Moy, though her focus is the reading of examples with what she comes to call, after Murdoch, a just and loving gaze. For Moy, we should approach problems in feminism by looking at particular cases rather than by positing a general theory of power and oppression that can tell us what is going on in advance of the particular case. So for Moy, intersectional oppression is like a language that we as feminists need to learn and to shape. So instead of deciding that words or concepts are essentially problematic or exclusionary, we should look at language and see what words are doing in use and how they acquire meaning in use. So instead of saying that this or that word woman, for instance, will be exclusionary in all cases, we should do stuff like talk about how specific uses of language reflect oppression and exclusion. So I was reading yesterday about a campaign in the UK to stop doctors using phrases like lazy uterus and geriatric pregnancy. And on the other hand, we should talk through experiences in order to come up with the right words to reflect them, like our shared experiences. So for instance, we as a feminist community have learned together through all kinds of different variously fraught conversations, what we mean by transphobia, dead naming, misgendering, a lot of these terms that we didn't used to have, but now we do have. So neither, I think, of these feminist readings of Cavell, no, I know, mention moral perfectionism, but I think that the ethical orientation toward attentiveness in both of them can be supplemented with the idea that we're implicated as selves in the shared project of feminism. Moral perfectionism, I think, is important here for at least two reasons. First, because it helps us stay critical in that it helps us resist conformity and like just be bummed out by it wherever we see it. And two, because it helps us see the extent to which self and community are mutually constituted and mutually sustaining. So I think contemporary feminist activists like just get this. One of the ways we tend to determine as feminists whether we really mean what we say is to ask each other to show up, where showing up means giving an account of your own moral intuitions with regard to the matter at hand. The idea that the maintenance of our feminist community requires something, the idea here is that the maintenance of our feminist community requires something like from you. So I guess like maybe it's a little over the top to call this thing feminism requires of us genius, but Cavell and Emerson mean by genius a state of receptivity, one in which I acknowledge my commitment to what Cavell calls the unattained city, one within the one we sustain, one we know there is no good reason we perpetually fail to attain. And I'm going to wrap up on that somewhat enigmatic note, as is my wont. But I will end with a confession of my own vulnerability. In sending this paper to you, this is the first thing I've written since maternity leave, and it's, I think, a response just to the past year. We've all had a year that for me consisted mostly in caring for an infant while following the news compulsively, which was weird, in total lockdown in England. And I think, yeah, it's an attempt to make sense of events, but also of the sort of things that bother me about the way we talk to each other in our, like, mostly in our online spaces, but, you know, in our lives together. And I think it's also kind of an attempt to articulate the love I feel for the people in my life and the sense of responsibility that I feel as a member of the feminist community, which I think was another thing that we all felt kind of compelled to acknowledge, you know, as we watched the marches in the streets. I mean, probably you guys were actually marching. I was watching, but, you know, felt this need to acknowledge my responsibility as a member of a community. So anyway, I know there's a lot I've left out and I'm begging like all kinds of questions. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, great. That was excellent. Yeah, claps all around. Yeah, like I said, oh, just a second. I think, do I have to let someone in here? I really enjoyed this paper. I thought I found it very inspiring, very thought-provoking on a number of different levels. So, so thank you for the paper, and thank you for that great presentation. Like I said, I have some questions, but I am happy to yield the floor here if somebody else wants to jump in with a first question. Pause here. Is Eva, are you trying to go? You're still muted. I have to ask you, right? I don't know.
Mute. Okay.
Are you wanting to ask a question?
Well, if nobody else has a question, I have a question.
Okay,
I found the paper really interesting as well. I really enjoyed it, and I've had a couple of run-ins with Cavell, not clashes, but finding Cavell useful at certain points, particularly in trying to articulate what the importance was of speaking from one's own voice in philosophy. And I don't know enough Cavell to integrate it with all the things that you've said, but it seems to me to be entirely part of that. And one of the things that really stood out for me in your paper was the quote, and I think it's from Hammer, I'm not sure, that, or maybe it's directly from Cavell, I don't remember, that what we do when we resist conformity, but what we do, I think, in resisting universalizations is we say, I'm the exception. I'm an exception. This is not universal because you hadn't included me. And that's, of course, what women feminists said. Feminist philosophers certainly said that about the canon, about philosophical universalization. But I'm so interested in how that notion of individuality stands in opposition to the individualist, to the individualism that feminism rejects. And I was wondering.
So hard. That's such a hard question. I know. Well, so I mean, I had to teach an entire master's seminar on this, and I still haven't figured it out. But I like was I was like, this year every master's student were reading Cavell and Emerson, and they were like, no. But it is just such a hard question, and I need to be able to articulate the answer more fully than I have in this paper. But I just need to think about it more. But basically, I think that what is really radical and productive in Cavell is that those two things are the same: the community and the individual. I mean, of course, the individual reflects the community, and the community reflects the individual. And I think what rubs us the wrong way intuitively as feminists when we hear this kind of claim is that we think, well, we have to separate moral and political life. I mean, it's almost like a dogmatic thing that we do. In feminist theory, to say like political life is, action that arises in this kind of agonistic way, wherein we, sort of like cannot assume in advance that we are like these individual marked off selves. We just sort of, and I just think that picture of politics is unrealistic. And that's kind of where this grew out of, because to me, what I see people doing, and I've written an article on this, it's about loneliness and about arising out of loneliness, and what I see people doing in like my classrooms, but in everyday life, is figuring out who we are together by using their words to express that community. And I think that that's what feminists do, like that what you're talking about. And I think the example of Nora sort of shows this, that what feminists do when they say, I'm the exception here, is not say, I, Sarah, walled off individual, and the exception here. They say, I am risking the sort of disagreement or resistance to this conformity so that I might be intelligible to a future community, the community that I know somehow
expand the community.
Yeah.
Expand the community.
Yeah.
Right.
But I don't know. I mean, I probably
make it truer. Make it truer, right?
Yes. 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 I mean, that notion of truth is so interesting, the way that it is used in Emerson, because that quote about genius being knowing what is true in your heart to be true for all men. I mean, that is to me an extraordinarily relational claim. That is not like a statement of pure individualism, because that thing that you have that in your heart is a sort of manifestation of your reading of the world. And that's one of the things I really like about Cavell's just sort of meta understanding of philosophy, which is that it is the reading and rereading of texts. I mean, it's just a sort of constant conversation in which we are, engaged as selves, but also always in relation to other selves. And he grounds this, I'm sure that actually Naomi can explain this better than me, in skepticism, in the sort of history of skepticism and philosophy. And he says that we can't know other selves, we can only acknowledge them. And I think it's kind of the same for our own selves. I mean, we just acknowledge that we are selves, but that doesn't mean we can know what we are completely. I'm rambling.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's go to the next. So I have Naomi, and then Asha, and then Christine, and then Alex. So we'll go in that order. Naomi, I think you just got kicked off and were able to come back. Well, good. I'm glad you were able to come back. Welcome back.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I got ended up out early on in Ava's question. So I'm out of it for that reason. Also, sadly, just swamped with other things and haven't had a chance to read the paper yet. And also, Sarah, you've done a much deeper dive into Cavell's work on moral perfectionism than I have. So with all of those massive caveats, I love this project. It's wonderful. And I'm so excited to be, I hope, engaging with you in a way that's not completely off the rails. One of the things that I've been struck by, I read Cavell as I read Wittgenstein very much in the company of Maria Lugones. And
Yes.
and so one of the things that I connect with most in Cavell is, as I think you were saying just when I was coming back in, around acknowledgement and acknowledgement before knowledge. And in particular with Lugones's latest, most recent work on decoloniality, the importance of being disoriented and discombobulated, and of, as your wonderful, the deep feeling that all is not right with the world, including with others I need to engage with in ways that it may be right for me, but it's not right for them, and that I don't understand, and that I lose my own voice, that I don't know what I'm going to say, that I don't understand what they're saying, but I need to engage through and with that deep disorientation. So I'm wondering if there's a tension between the finding and acknowledging and speaking with and taking responsibility for one's own voice, with acknowledging the disorientation and the almost loss of voice that can come from acknowledging the other I do not yet understand.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. I think there's a bunch of really rich stuff in Cavell that speaks to this. For him, and I think just sort of zoomed out from like what he actually says, the way that he does his work is very much in oblique strategies. I mean, that's Brian, but you know that it's a sort of, and like Emerson, that he doesn't say, it's not my place to speak for other people because I am a privileged white man, which, I mean, I would want him to say that. I would have wanted him maybe to say that more. But I think he knows it, and so what he does, as with Emerson, is sort of listen before speaking, acknowledge before. Well, I don't know if he does this all the time. He can also go off on his own little pompous rants, but he definitely is very much committed to the idea that it is not always the right thing to do to speak up. Like that, this taking moral responsibility for oneself does not mean that I sort of like engineer this Instagram platform, for instance, that is, me, Sarah Lucas, performing my wokeness. Like that's definitely what he's talking about. We can't do like that claiming community is super, super hard. It takes, a really careful, and I think even talking about it, I felt really uncomfortable. In writing the paper, I felt uncomfortable because I was like, it's something that I mostly fail to do, like that we all mostly fail to do, because it's really, really hard to acknowledge sufficiently the things that perplex us, puzzle us, that we have to then speak together. And also it's so often that we just lapse into conformity because it's just too hard to try and say what's really going on here without either, embarrassing myself or risking saying something, offensive or whatever. So it's just really hard. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question about disorientation. Yeah, I guess
guess-
I mean, it's just important.
Yeah, I guess I was pushing at that it's not only that I may not be able to, or it might not be appropriate for me to speak for others,
Mhm.
but I may lose the ability to speak for myself. And it may be appropriate and necessary for me to lose the ability to say what the world is like from here,
Yes.
that I may become so disoriented, and that's important. And it pushes against including things that were part of second wave feminism about the body never lies, trust your own voice, and the ways in which, particularly as relatively privileged, especially white women, we've learned, I cannot trust my gut. I cannot trust my own voice. And what it means to sort of embrace that and how that fits with the way that you're reading Cavell in political context.
Yeah, that does speak to a worry that I have about this project more generally, which I think is like, is it possible to kind of read this paper or this way of thinking about moral perfectionism as like, because I think when I reread the example, I was like, is this what I'm doing? Like as me being like, I really do pay attention as a white woman to these things that do not, necessarily occur to me right away. But when I'm called out, oh baby, do I come in and correct what I have gotten wrong? Like I don't want that to be what this is about, because I think that so I think I just need to be able to figure out how to articulate that better, because I think you're absolutely right that we don't have in our guts or something, or in ourselves, or just in our being in the world as selves, the capacity to do this all the time. Like it's just not possible for me always to know the lay of the land. And I think that's where the education thing comes in. And I actually think that is why moral perfectionism is so important, because as I was trying to sort of say about like shame being the thing that motivates us toward our better selves, like I think we all feel that shame all the time, when we are either like called out, or when we realize, oh, I have been sort of speaking for people in a way that is just wrong, or I have been saying things that are like sort of born out of my privilege that I haven't recognized as such. And I feel shame when I recognize that, but not shame that is going to inspire in me some kind of defensiveness or going to close me down, just shame that makes me realize, no, I don't always have the capacity to speak in the political voice that ultimately I will want to speak in, that I'm going to always work towards speaking in.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Asha.
Thanks. Yeah, so I thought the paper was really, really interesting. And actually, Naomi's question now has me rethinking what I was going to say, because she really identified, I think, two areas that I wanted to talk about. So, and I don't know Cavell's work, so the lexicon that you're working with there is all new to me. But I wondered about, just speaking for others as a value. It seemed odd to assert as a value in the context of some of the other considerations you were raising. And I think Naomi, has made that more complicated now. And I also think, I guess the other sort of main sort of concept that I'm thinking about here is about the community. And so I guess my question is for you to define community here, so, and I'm thinking about, showing up for the community, for the feminist community. Of course, that's so fraught. And even the articulation of that as a kind of moral ideal often sort of fails to appreciate just how different people's values are going to be, within the feminist community. So where those values are going to be, it might not be the values, but it might be the salience of the different concerns in individuals' lives. And here I'm thinking of a, friend of mine who, various friends of mine who are women of color living in Iowa, who, make choices not to attend rallies and to instead like ensure that they're having s'mores with their kids every weekend, as an individual choice and as an act of resistance, but also as an act of flourishing. So I worry, and of course this is, there's sort of the standard concern, is it white feminism kind of asserting itself over overall feminisms? so the worry is, a worry about this sort of the content of this value of showing up.
Mhm.
Is it, how can you sort of fill that out in a way that's not going to actually do quite a good deal of violence to women who don't ascribe to a particularly narrow conception of, say, feminist activism. And I guess that the final piece of this is that I think it's linked to the sort of valorization of political action, and I wonder if you can kind of contextualize that a bit more. I mean, I know you're working with Cavell here, so
Yeah.
perhaps you're taking you're taking on board parts of that view. But so I guess as a way of asking for further explanation, I'll also raise this as a kind of objection. So perhaps the value of political action should be really contextualized as one that applies to people with certain kinds of, say, proclivities, that applies to people who want, who want to do such a thing.
Yeah.
Take into account, individuality, when we think about that too, and then also that takes into account privilege. So I think, privilege, but also individuality have to be included in that sort of assessment of that as an ideal.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because like the problem that you just expressed is kind of the problem that I have, that I'm like the problem that you just or so the way that you just defined the understanding of feminist community as just political activism is something that I want to resist and have really kind of been trying to figure out a way to push back against. So that's like what I'm kind of trying to do in this paper, is to say that that's actually wrong. But I can see where that would be something that would seem to follow from my saying that self and community are mutually constituting, and we have a moral responsibility to be members of a political community. I don't think that that looks like marching in a rally. I don't think it looks like teaching philosophy. I don't think it, or feminism, or that it has to look like really like any kind of pre-understood idea of activism at all. I think that Cavell himself was not really very interested in political activism. And I think for reasons that were to do with the sort of primacy for him of the moral self, the ethical self, that he thought had to be attended to in order to productively and authentically engage in the political. So I think, yes, these things are mutually constituting, but they're not the exact same thing. Like we kind of go back and forth between them over the course of our lives. And the way that he explains it sort of in Cities of Words is he talks about how we are sort of left, whether we like it or not, stuck between a kind of a nihilism or a cynicism, which is, he says, our inability to want the world, and a kind of recourse to an impersonal structure that stands in for what we think about the world. But in between those things is the sort of need for us to think about how we are a part of the world. And we can reject it most of the time, but it's always kind of there. And so for Cavell, the political community that he's talking about, and this is something that maybe I shouldn't talk about because I wanted someone to ask me about it, or not because I want, but like, because I was like maybe hoping someone wouldn't ask me about it, because it's very, I think it's a big problem. For Cavell, the political community is American democracy. It's the idea or promise of American democracy that is yet to come, which is this sort of, for him, like in principle, completely inclusive political community. Like anyone who wants to be a part of that political community is and can be part of that political community. And I think one of the sort of grandiose claims that I don't make in the paper, but that was underwriting my thinking as I was writing the paper, is that I think that feminism is that's kind of what feminism is doing, like in a kind of global way, that like there isn't in advance something that we can say will be, a respectable or not respectable way of doing feminism. It's all about these kind of conversations that we have within an inclusive community that, enable us to kind of forge together what we think our world should look like. I'm sorry if that sounds really vague. Yeah, so it's about transforming the community that we share. Yeah,
Just a quick.
but I mean, I think that I would have to know your friends who have s'mores instead of go on marches, but I'm sure that in talking to them, they'd have all kinds of things to say about politics.
So, but is there a community? I mean, does that foreclose? Does that assume?
So you mean like what are the boundaries of the community?
Well, I guess thinking about about discursive exchanges and about how so often the terms for intelligibility are bound by a particular discursive space that might, where the experience of oppression can create shared discursive spaces. So sometimes it seems, insurmountable to convey the reality of the oppressed space to those who do not occupy it. And so I guess I'm skeptical about the burdens that seeking a community will impose for people who occupy those oppressed spaces.
Yeah. Okay. That I definitely get. I think so. Cavell's idea is that no matter who we are, we have moral conversations, and I think like within. But he also says in his critique of Rawls that the people who are most often left out of the conversations of justice are the people who, you're talking about the people who are like occupying positions of oppression, alienation, marginalization, who don't feel that the conversation is for them. So like ideally what I would think this way of thinking about moral conversation would be to expand our understanding of the political to include just the ordinary lives of everyone and to attend to the ordinary lives of everyone. But I see what you're saying. The problem that might arise there for me doing this as a white woman, a white, intellectual or whatever, is that it puts some kind of pressure on people in places that I don't understand or know to explain those places to me so that then I can feel in community with them. Is that what you're saying?
Well, not exactly. I mean, it's not exactly I wasn't thinking of it as a criticism of sort of the subject position of the person writing the paper, but rather some skepticism about the notion of community.
Oh, okay.
That you're working with.
Okay.
Where I mean, I guess I'll just follow up and then I'll go on mute. But where I guess I am somewhat skeptical about the sort of practicability, I guess, of achieving discursive spaces that are shaped by genuine equality. And this, came out in my session a couple of weeks ago. But that's what I'm wondering if this kind of the lived discursive community that Cavell is arguing for, and that I think you're developing, and thinking about, whether that in fact will impose further burdens on people who, I mean, I think it imposes different burdens on people, differently positioned, however they're positioned. But then when you locate them in a hierarchy, that hierarchy is going to create additional burdens of intelligibility. So I think that's that, it's a concern about communication within the community. Really.
Totally. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that built into it has to be a lot of the tools that we've come up with as feminists over the years, which include like preserving spaces as much as we possibly can for people to speak to each other in ways, that work for them, so that like the communicability outside the bounds of like our smaller communities is always going to be really difficult. And I think part of the ethics of care aspect of Cavell that is underdeveloped in the paper really is just a shift, and it has to be a conversion, I guess, for everyone. And I'm not saying that it is going to work or make me able to, I don't know. I don't know if I think that that does the violence that you're saying it does, but maybe it does. But you know, a shift for everyone toward an understanding of life as important, if every aspect of life is important, as the details of life as important. So like Logie in another article talks about how a corollary of this might be to just like even upwardly value mere life as it's, you know, now conceived in contemporary political theory, like in Agamben or whatever, that like even the sort of things we think of as abject are worthy of our utmost attention and care, and that maybe we start there when we have conversations that pull us out of our. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Now I'm babbling again. Sorry. Yeah, I guess because I don't know exactly if what you're sort of getting at is whether I'm not sure what part of this paper or this idea of community might do the violence, but maybe I'm just being deliberately obtuse. I'm sorry, I'm really tired.
So Christine's on deck here, but I think Naomi has a follow-up to this exact theme, this question, right?
Yes, I wonder if this is responsive to the issues that Asha was raising, that very often there's the problem of people who are more at the center of hegemonic intelligibility, demanding intelligibility as a prerequisite to community or engagement, or to use the term that Lagunas uses most, coalition. And that, you know, in order to engage, we have first to understand, and that puts the burden of intelligibility on the group and the people who have been hermeneutically marginalized. And what if we, and I think following Cavell in many ways on the primacy of acknowledgement, and then following Lagunas, if we plunged into the difficult work of coalition building, maybe even community building, but more coalition across communities, plunged into that, take the risk, make ourselves vulnerable to engaging with that when we don't understand, without requiring that the other make themselves intelligible to us in our terms before we can engage. And I wonder if that's a way of addressing some of those concerns.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think the kind of conversation that I'm talking about here, like a moral conversation that goes well, where people really do show a little bit of themselves and then recognize the person to whom they're speaking. I think these kinds of moral conversations really do happen like all the time, but I think it's very hard for us to put any kind of like criteria in place in advance of them to say how they're going to go, because I think as soon as we do that, as soon as we say like, you know, I'm expecting intelligibility, I'm expecting these kinds of you know, sort of ways of expressing yourself or ways of, you know, talking about the same thing to come from you in order for this conversation to work. It's always really risky to have these conversations. And I think like, I mean, because one of the things also I was thinking about writing a paper is like, I miss having conversations in bars with people that I don't agree with at all. And I miss having conversations, you know, with like my Trump supporting second cousins and first cousins, like my uncle who came over last night, who's a Trump guy. And I miss like having these conversations with people that are really fraught. And I think it's like something that we've kind of lost the skill of doing over the course of the last year a little bit. And I think, so I don't know how to explain how that gets at your worry, but I think that it does, because I feel like I don't want to have anything in this account that would suggest that there is an expectation on the part of the morally perfectionist self to get anything specific out of any kind of moral conversation. Like the person who is doing the work of, you know, wanting to belong to a community is going to be like wrong, maybe sometimes violently wrong over the course of their sort of life as a member of a community. And there may be, you know, an arc of education where at one point they're really ignorant about the lived experience of other people, and then in some other iteration of their life they're less so. But you know, they may not be like I think the political community that is the sort of context for feminism is like wildly buried. And like, maybe it's worth just flagging really quickly that Cavell kind of like draws the boundary around political community, democratic community, where the only sort of people he imagines to be outside it are people who like they speak and we don't understand what they're saying at all. Like their words make no sense to us, he says. So like Andrew Norris in his book, sorry if this is a little long-winded, but in his book, he uses as a contemporary example of that kind of person who's beyond the realm of sense, Rick Santorum, whose wife miscarried quite early, or I mean, it was at 20 weeks, and they brought home the fetus from the hospital and had all the children like hold it and kiss it and say goodbye to it. And then they buried it and had like a funeral for it. And for Andrew Norris, this is like beyond the realm of sense. It's like, it's a community you couldn't possibly understand. It's someone, but I read it and I was like, I can kind of understand it. Like, I mean, there's something that's going on there that I can kind of understand. I think that's actually kind of not a great example. And I think that all of that to say that I think that we find moral connections with people all over the place, and we cannot expect to know where we're going to find them. And we cannot say in advance what they're going to be, which is like a super pomo answer. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. But I just think that that's the contingency thing. And that's why care as a virtue is the only constant, right? Like, or like attentiveness as a virtue is the only constant. Like these experiments could go really off the rails. But yeah. Yeah.
Christine.
Yeah, thanks so much. I am new to the group, so thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is a great paper. Really enjoyed it. So I'm at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm a communication scholar. I study rhetoric and performance. And so I've been writing for a while on acknowledgement, so rhetorical claims for acknowledgement in performances, often in diasporic communities. I also work in India. And so I was just really excited to read this. I've been engaging with Cavell for a while. And it's just a fantastic project. So right now, what I'm working on is an essay at how acknowledgement works in political conversations that are fraught, that are really contentious. So you're sort of hitting a lot of high notes for me in your talk. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because it's something I'm writing about right now and really enjoying and struggling with it, both at the same time, as it usually is the work of so I'm in a gender and women's studies department.
Oh, I just read that.
Oh, good. Okay, so we're on the same page. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, good. So this is kind of the piece that I'm kind of springboarding off of for this essay. And for folks who haven't read this book, it's basically Brown is an abolitionist, queer activist who's interested in transformational justice. And the question that gets raised is, you were just talking about, what do you do with your uncle, who's a Trump follower, and what do you do? And you missed that conversation, right? That is actually something I think that's very, very true, at least in my experience of the pandemic. But the other question is, what do we do when we're supposedly in solidarity with one another but we're not, we don't totally agree, right? And some of the ways that cancel culture has operated, particularly within feminist movements, with a plural there, is really fascinating. So the argument that Brown makes is that cancel culture, in many ways, while productive, is not actually productive. And I think the question that I have, so there's a question here, I promise you, is, well, what do you think Cavell would say to that? Right. So in a lot of ways, as a scholar of rhetoric, I'm interested in the claims that are made for acknowledgement. Right. And in a lot of ways, that's embedded in cancel culture discourse, right? So what are your thoughts on this? That's my question.
It's really hard because like, I don't know. I mean, first of all, I don't know what my thoughts would be, or well, I have lots of thoughts, but I don't want to have any kind of systematic thoughts about like when exactly should we cancel someone. But I think let's come back to that. But on the other thing, the thing I really like that she does in that book is talk about the distinction between canceling and calling out. And I think that calling out to me is really just asking people to mean what they say. So like Cavell has this example in the Claim of Reason about the slave owner as saying that slaves are animals. They thinking of slaves as animals. And Cavell's response is, you cannot possibly mean what you say. You have these people dressed in suits and bringing you dinner and, bearing your children, and they're clearly not animals. You clearly don't actually mean that when you say that they're animals. So that's a sort of form of call out. I think that's what we do when we call out. We say, hey, you're saying this, you can't mean it. And I think a lot of times that does work when done repeatedly to exhaustion, by people who are constantly involved in feminist politics. I mean, it takes a long time sometimes because obviously the reaction of defensiveness gets in the way. But yeah, so that was something that struck me reading that book. But I think also the stuff about transitional justice and abolition can be read really productively with Cavell, because I think that the community to come, the eventual ordinary, the community to come is very much one where those kinds of claims about, who we are going to help us change who we are going to help us transform who we are. And I actually heard about that book because I like to listen to Still Processing, the New York Times podcast with Jenna Wortham and Wesley Thomas, and they just talk to each other. And I think sometimes podcasts are really forced and feel quite, performative in a way that is just people hustling for money or whatever. But that they really do just have these genuine, interesting conversations. And they were talking about that book as kind of an important way to because what a lot of times what they do is call out stuff in a productive way. So they were talking about A Promising Young Woman, the film that just came out with Carey Mulligan, and about how they got a lot out of it as, a sort of new way of thinking about rape culture and consent and misogyny, but that, as people of color watching it, the sort of deus ex machina that was, sorry for the spoiler, the police coming in at the end struck them as, offensive, actually. And I think, that was just sort of a little form of call out. All of which to say it's that kind of moral conversation where there's a lot going on. There are a lot of different, acknowledgements being made, but there's this sort of expression of something off or wrong that shows us what we're missing, or showed me what I was missing in listening to that conversation. But then I think that I'm still haunted by Asha's point about does that mean that I'm expecting people to make intelligible for me their experiences in such a way that then it helps me educate myself, and I need to think about it.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. I appreciate it. It was a great paper.
Thanks.
Okay, Sarah, I think I get to ask my question now, which is gonna just pick up on something that several other people have said, and you've been talking about a little bit, but I want to ask it, and it has to do with community and Trump people and all those kinds of things. And I kind of want to ask the question by describing the process that I had of reading your paper and kind of what I was thinking as I went along, and then I'll get to the question. It'll be brief. So the first part of your paper, right? You're talking about Cavell and the democratic community, and you have this the line about the purpose of disagreement isn't to win the argument, but rather to explore the reasons that individuals might have for holding certain views. And so I read that and I thought oh, this is great, this gives me a new way to think about how I can engage with, say, the Trump people who live down the street from me, and have this conversation. I don't have to convince them that they're wrong. I just have to try to understand them. But then I hit a roadblock with that pretty quickly because I thought I mean, and also it happened just, listen to the radio, some politician explaining, I don't know where it was, and, one of these states, Florida or something, where, now, passing these new voting, kind of voting restriction laws, and the explanation he was giving for why this is important. And, it's really, we're not trying to keep anyone from voting. This is just about the integrity of the vote. And it's just kind of like, oh, bullshit, man, come on. Like that's not even authentic. But then I was thinking like, with Trump people, who will tell me that the election was stolen, and it's just like, there's no evidence for that. And, they say, oh, you've fallen into it. The conspiracy has covered it up. So then I was like, no, there's got to be a fair amount of actual agreement in the community about at least like standards of evidence or proof to begin with. And so then, this is just a few pages later, but I get to your Dina and April example, and the interchange they're having, and it's a contentious, interchange, but it seems productive. And you're right, the exchange of moral intuitions in the conversation above, Dina and April, is made possible by an openness to disagreement. We can and then like on the next page, we can easily imagine it failing as a moral conversation if one or both of the participants decided in advance that the other person was completely wrong. So then, right, this seems to be a radical shrinking there of the community, right? Because now it has to be a community of people who actually have a fair amount of moral agreement already about standards of evidence, and also about some kind of like purpose maybe of what they're trying to achieve, or the kind of people that they want to be with one another. So then this becomes a much smaller kind of community of people talking to themselves, which of course is problematic in many ways, because now you just have people talking to themselves, sort of trying to each express, and maybe achieving, greater clarity and in a useful way. And this can be very important, but it's not reaching at all outside of the community. So then this perplexed me about your using this to frame feminism, right? Because feminism, right? If I mean, you can have these kinds of conversations, sort of like we are now within a feminist community, and it can go pretty well. But can you have these? I mean, almost by this logic, right? I mean, you have to have agreement on all these things. So you've kind of painted feminism into a box with this, or I just don't see. I don't see how you reach outside of it.
I think we should all be feminists. I'm an evangelical. I think that is a very, very big issue here, and it's an issue for Cavell as well. But I think, so like, I think that the QAnon people would qualify as making no sense to me, even though I have tried. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't necessarily try, but I think that there are actually different realms of sense there. But I would be sort of reluctant, or at least a bit, I would worry about couching that in terms of facts versus truth, which is what we usually tend to do, I think, right? I would say they're different communities of sense. And I think within that community of the QAnon people, facts and truth are that's what they know, and we don't know. And so like Linda Zerilli has a recent paper about this on fact checking and Foucault, and she's like, look, fact checking is not working, it's just making it worse. And I think so that those sort of like silent silos of sense cannot be rejoined through, we're right and they're wrong. And I don't think that that's what, so what I kind of want to be able to sort of eventually say is that like an inclusive ethics that's sort of grounded in a feminist ethics of care is for everyone. But my uncle wouldn't really like that. Who was over last night. That being said, my uncle and I did have kind of a productive conversation where he was like, hey, his friend Todd, geez, like is one of these storm the Capitol dudes. And my uncle is more like, get your laws off my guns kind of dude. And there's a sort of overlapping community there. But, my uncle is also an attorney, and he's quite intelligent in his own way. And he and I were able to have a conversation where he was able to sort of, like, I told him about this paper today, and he was like, oh yeah, care is important. Oh yeah, no, I do think care is important. And so like I think there is a sort of slippery and sliding there that is like there's a crisscrossing network of languages that we're always using all the time that put us in a lot of different communities. And I want to say the feminist inclusive community is the uber community. And I kind of feel like in some ways justified saying this because I feel like it's gone mainstream. I'm like, hey, Joe, that's what you're saying, right? Like you're saying this is who we are, you know, we are. And then do I mean Americans? I don't know, maybe. That's a problem. But you know, we are people who think that care is infrastructure. We are people who, you know, like we're starting to sort of see these kind of claims made about like what we are as a people that I feel like are sort of yeah, loosely feminist claims. And of course, I don't want it to seem like by feminist community, I mean any one thing. I do mean a sort of open-ended, inclusive ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So,
so, you know, I can buy into this idea. I like this idea of like maybe, you know, using care as this hook, you know, this language that crosses a number of different communities, and you can enter into conversation with people in those communities through care, and you know, I think that's very important. But then it also seems to point to this idea that then you're just gonna, you know, you're gonna kind of be able to intercommunication out through this one narrow, you know, hook, but then other things are going to be closed off for you. You know, having to, you know, I mean, you know, you talk about QAnon as people as being, you know, kind of a different sensibility, or, you know, I would extend that to, you know, maybe 30% of Americans.
I haven't been here.
I don't think it's that narrow. I mean,
yeah.
You know, talking to sort of neighbors or even
yeah.
brief, and it's just like right away, it's just like, what? Like, you know, you heard what?
Yeah.
You know, like what? Where are you getting this stuff?
Yeah.
So I don't know. So, you know, I mean, that's a real problem for this kind of expressive moral democracy. But then also, you know, again, I just think it's a real problem for feminism then, because of this way in which, you know, I think feminist ideas, you know, you know, the down girl, you know, Kate Mann, and misogyny, and the, you know, I mean, I think are just really emphasizing the degree to which, you know, this just provokes, you know, rage in large numbers of people, you know, just an assertion of, you know, just a woman acting as an equal. Right.
Yeah. And like, I was talking about that very thing with a colleague who she and I are co-chairs of the EDI committee. And there's a guy in our department that keeps writing these op-eds about how decolonizing the curriculum is, you know, cultural Marxism, one of those guys. And she was like, you know, I mean, I think he's just a wounded, you know, like she was like trying to like, you know, make all of these sort of excuses for him in this way of like, if he would just be vulnerable, if he would just, and it's like, he is an asshole. That guy is an asshole. And I hate that guy. And so I think, yeah, it is really, that is one of the worries I have, I think, about this way of thinking, which is that it isn't critical enough in that way that you're talking about, like that it maybe like there's maybe a tendency to slide into this kind of idea that if we just talk to people, if we just do, you know, if we just have a conversation with people, then we'll get to some way that we can figure out after much discussion whether or not we respect their point of view. And I don't think that that's always appropriate. Absolutely not. I think, yeah, that we need to hold on to our rage and our conviction and our feeling that, you know, and also like, but I mean, you know, then another thing, when I read Down Girl, like I assigned Down Girl and Jennifer Nadelsky's Laws Relations back to back in my feminism seminar for my seniors, because so in Down Girl, Kate Mann says, you know, it's our duty as feminists to provoke misogynists, like basically to troll them. And I'm like, yes, I get this, right? Because like in doing this, and I think we could maybe figure out a way to say that is like a kind of Cavelian move of saying, like, you can't possibly mean what you say, right? And that all the conversion stories you hear of these guys who are just trolling, sending death threats, like, you know, that when they eventually do like talk to feminists, they're like, maybe a way in is sometimes like, you love your daughter and your wife, right? And then they're like, oh, I love my daughter and I'm also a woman. Oh, you're also, you know, and then eventually there is this kind of conversion toward, oh yeah, I'm an asshole. Like that does happen. But so anyway, I read that and they're all like all on board with it. And then I sort of like shift to this thing about, you know, we're all relational selves, right? And we all have these sort of like responsibilities as strongly as we have these responsibilities to like be really angry and to you know, speak from a position of like political conviction. You know, we also have these responsibilities to acknowledge the extent to which we are like also constituted by all of these other ways of being in the world, these other people who help us and care for us, and our own vulnerability is what sort of enables us to be in the world at all. So I just think that tension is really fascinating, but I don't know necessarily what to do with it or how to resolve it. I mean, my students usually are just like, you know, kill all men. And I'm like, yeah, fine, okay, let's stick with that. That's okay. But like, you know, I think it's not gonna, I don't know. I feel like when I was reading this paper for today, I was like, did Oprah write this? Like, it is a little bit like, you know, speak your truth, baby. And I don't know. Maybe it's because I've been teaching instead of researching that it came out the way that it did, because I think that it's something you want to give to people, like whoever they are, you know, the ability to just kind of be like, this is how I'm gonna, you know, show up for my anger or discomfort with the world in the way it is. Like that has to belong to you.
Yeah.
30% of America though, I don't know. I haven't been here. That's another thing. So maybe, because like when you
know, I may be overestimating, but
no, I hear what you're saying, but I mean, I also think that like one of the things that happens since we haven't seen each other in person and have only been seeing each other as like digital avatars of ourselves is that, you know, I mean, we call it increased polarization, but is that we've started to see people in the way that I say it in the paper is like as part of an impersonal structure before we talk to them, you know? And so I think, I imagine like there's all kinds of things I imagined my uncle would think before we had that conversation. And he's my uncle. I've known him my whole life, you know, and then in talking to him, he didn't think some of those things and others of them he did. And I was offended, but I was also like, okay, you know, it's nice that you think that women are people.
yeah, and I get, well, I'm sorry, I don't know if anyone else, I mean, you know, at this point we're getting towards the end, so you can just kind of speak up if they want to get in this, but maybe just really briefly, I mean, what happens, you know, in the Cavelian world when you decide you can't respect someone, you know, when you have the conversation, I mean, then you just write them off, like then you're just like, that person's outside the community, like I'm done with them. That's it seems a problem, right?
Well, he doesn't say that, but I think that he probably should. I mean, I'm like, I mean, then back to the Christine's cancellation question. I mean, I do think it is sometimes appropriate to say, we don't want to hear any more from you.
Yeah, but then this just becomes, you know, a source of continued polarization or greater polarization, right?
You know, in the paper that I'm writing right now, one of the things that I'm looking at is a couple of it's two little sort of intro vignettes to the paper are two different newspaper articles that were in the New York Times post-election. And basically people were saying, I tried so hard during the Trump presidency to reach out, right? To try to make those connections. I worked for 3 years going, you know, to communities that were not my own. And while I was able to have civil conversations with these people and everybody was very polite, at the end of the day, there was not a movement on positions, political positionality, right? Or moral positionality. Everyone was very, and from the Midwest, I can understand that really well, right? That like Midwest are nice, right? You know?
Yeah.
So no one's going to engage you directly, but they're definitely not moving their register at all. And so I think, that's a real thing, right? That like people I know who are activists who have, as long as I've known them, have been, I'm going to go into communities and try to create social change. They are exhausted, right? By the last 4 years and the pandemic and, having families and trying to figure out what the bottle is and trying to, it's just, I think that when we talk about lived realities, all of those things are political. All of those things are what our acknowledgement moves through in every conversation, right? So yeah, it's tough. I don't know.
Totally. I mean, I listened finally to Arlie Hochschild's book Strangers in Their Own Land this year, the Audible version of it, and I had this really weird experience of her, I mean, I think that she paid such thorough, careful attention to these people who to her were so foreign, but I was like, those are my people you're describing. I mean, I'm from East Texas. My family's from Louisiana. The whole first couple of chapters, she's like, these people go to Walmart, and I was like, yeah, that's, so I think I and I think about Maria Lugonis's earlier work a lot when I talk to myself about this stuff, about the sort of world traveling where, and I feel like I've come up against in the last couple of years an inability to do that as well, because of the sort of like extreme polarization that we see. Like I used to be able to sort of be here sometimes but even just in the week I've been home, I've seen, because I live in England where we don't even have trucks, I've seen these huge trucks with Blue Lives Matter stickers, and I feel afraid. I feel like, I feel something that I wouldn't have felt before. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm definitely not able to solve that big problem of, the Civil War. That is, I'm not sure this is going to get us there. So yeah. But then as far as the like casting out of our political community, I don't know. I think, that's sort of where I wanted to go with it productively. Like I wanted to be able to say, like, I have the moral authority of the Biden administration, but I have, this kind of moral authority now. Like I was reading an article in the paper yesterday about Maya Forstater, who's the woman in the UK who was dismissed for her transphobic views and is now suing, and it's this big deal. And that one of the things her defense attorney said was, we have reached a democratic consensus about this. Trans women are women. Like that's the democratic consensus, and that's where we are. So if you don't think that's right, then you don't get to keep your job. And I do think that is, yes, that is an implication here, that it is appropriate to say, like, as a feminist democratic community, like it's not okay to misgender someone because you think that they're a man and they're not. Does that help? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let me invite, is anyone else, anyone who hasn't had a chance to make a comment, ask a question, if you have any inklings, anything that's bothering you, I would like to invite you in to.
Looks like Alex.
Yeah, Alex had to go.
Oh, he's skipped.
Yeah, and then they.
So.
I'm not sure. Yeah, they've left.
Miguel.
Oh, there we are, Miguel.
Hey, hi. So I have a question, because I have, like, sometimes I have to deal with people, like family members that, they have different point of view, and I have to, like, sometimes I guess part of what you said earlier about conformity, like sometimes I used to stay quiet because I'm like, I don't know what to tell them. I know they're wrong and they sound ridiculous, but I usually don't know how to approach these situations, and I don't know what is the right thing to say when you hear people, making comments that are like, kind of derating towards women. What would be the right way to approach these kind of people so you can, like, actually change their mind without, insulting them or making them feel bad or anything like that? Because sometimes when you try to do that, you make them, be more against your ideas than actually, support your ideas. So how do you approach this kind of situation?
Yeah, I think it depends from situation to situation, but that is, like, I think that is the heart of the question here for me. Yeah, because I think that one of the things that is implicit in Cavell no, well, explicit as well, is that you have to meet people where they are. And one of the things he says is that if you think that what you will say is not going to be intelligible, then you shouldn't say it, like in a particular sort of situation of injustice, right? Like if so he draws on Emerson again here, and Emerson's talking about how every word people say chagrins him, and that, you know, they're not wrong in one particular, they're wrong in all particulars. He doesn't even know where to begin to correct them. And I think that is the feeling of resisting conformity, that everything bums you out. It's either me or the world is wrong. And I don't think that the thing to do in that situation is always to say, hey, you know, like, Dad, not personal, yes, it does. You know, like, you know, I'm a vegetarian, I have been for 20 years, stop making fun of me about it, or whatever. Like, but like all of these sorts of things that are aspects of, like, you know, the worlds that we're thrown into that rub us the wrong way. Like, sometimes we can't do anything about them. Sometimes we're just stuck in a feeling of just everything is wrong here. And I think the feminist move and the queer move and the move that, like, sort of feels like really comfortable and familiar to me is to find a place where you will be intelligible. And then I think you can come back to those communities where you feel you don't belong, or you feel alienated or marginalized, or every word they say chagrins you, and you can have that conviction that your community gives you the sort of authority to say things that may slightly over time shift, you know, what people believe that is wrong. Because, yeah, I mean, and I think, like, when in my own life, like as a university student, I would always argue with my father about feminism, and it never got me anywhere, you know. But then I became a feminist philosopher, and I was like, you know, like, now you have to take me seriously, you know. And you know, he doesn't necessarily, but, like, at least he knows I'm serious, you know. He knows that like what I'm doing is real to me, and is something that he can't write off as something he's seen in the paper, you know, the cultural Marxism infecting our campuses. He's like, this is my daughter, I love her, I know what she's like. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I would do.
No, I thank you. I mean, I'm like in the same, I feel like sometimes when I'm in those kind of situations, I want to say something, I just don't want to say the wrong thing in case, you know, I push them even farther of where they are. Because I would hear, like, my dad or my brother-in-law talking about my sister or my mom, like, oh, she's acting like this because she's a woman. Like, they will be wrong about something, but they will blame everything because she's a woman. So they wouldn't even take it seriously. It will be like, no, she's a woman, so she's emotional. So, I mean, they wouldn't even realize how wrong they are about what they're doing. And I will ask them, like, are you really sure that she's upset about this because she's a woman? Like, I will ask them again, because it's ridiculous that they will be wrong about something, and that will be the last resort to say something. The last thing that they will say as a last resort. And at that point, I get so frustrated. I don't know what to say. I just don't want, but, like, yeah, I guess, like, I have to learn how to speak to these kind of situations, but it is something extremely frustrating, and I would like to be able to change people's mind and help with this movement, but it is something I don't know how to do. So that's why I was asking. But yeah, thank you for what you said. I don't know, maybe I have to get a philosophy degree or something.
No, don't do that. Jeez, don't do that. Whatever you do. No, no, I don't know. I mean, the other thing is the whole, like, you can't possibly mean what you say, but that is always going to look kind of different depending on who you're talking to. That's the meeting people where they are thing. Like, you're like, I know you, Dad, I know you, brother-in-law. You can't possibly mean this. Like, that's what Cavell says we do when we call people to their better selves. We speak to their better selves. But yeah.
And that's exactly how I feel when they say things like that. There is no way you possibly mean this. Like, in my head, I'm like, there is no way. Like, and I ask them, like, do you really mean this? Like, but that's what I have to say. Like, there is no way you really are talking to me seriously. Like, next time I will say something like that. There's no way. Well,
I think you want to get in?
Yeah. Oh, I have a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So yeah, so Miguel's question has me thinking about sort of the temporal aspect of these communicative exchanges. And, I think, in some ways, sometimes in these engagements with people, with whom we very clearly disagree, it's a matter of sort of planting a seed, right? Maybe you say something and you leave it. You don't push at that time because it's just not going to go anywhere, and so I wonder, Sarah, if you can talk about the temporal sort of aspect of sort of the exchange. So do you, because I think what often happens is that people over time might be receptive to ideas if they hear them and then they go on, living sort of embodying their way of life, but the idea is kind of there, and then they might be more likely to change. But the person who they've had the engagement with is not really going to be necessarily going to be present to witness this transformation. So, or not, transformation is too strong of a word, but this change. So what do you think about the what's the time frame? What's the
yeah. The time frame is really long. I like Jeremy Waldron's idea of political theory as just political discussions without a deadline anyway. I think that it takes a long time to change our minds, no matter who we are. It takes me a long time to change my mind. I think it takes everybody a long time to change their mind. But I think then, more seriously, so an example that I didn't put in the paper that I had in the paper originally was because it was actually just me transcribing a real conversation from my life. And I was like, oh, I hope she doesn't read that. Anyway, it was for me and a colleague, and we had a real sort of deep disagreement, and we've known each other for now 5 years or whatever, and we have a real deep disagreement about whether or not it's okay to share finances with your husband. And it didn't really come out that was what the disagreement was until we had the conversation sort of obliquely a bunch of different times. And we were both sort of struggling, trying to get jobs on the job market at the same time. I kind of had no problem letting my partner pay for me because, no, really. And ethically, it's a real difference. And she had this deep, inbuilt sense that was wrong, that was morally wrong, and she wouldn't do it. And so she was working. Both of our partners had jobs and could support us. So we were both very lucky already anyway, but she wouldn't, and I was fine with it. And there was all this friction, in our sort of relationship as, colleagues, but also friends. And then, it sort of came to a head, and we talked about it, and I came to understand a lot more, so why she feels the way she does. Her background is just totally different from mine. Her parents forced her to buy groceries from the time she was 14. That was just the way she grew up. And I live in a very nice Houston waspy house. And, and I think at the beginning of our conversation wanted to think that I had a more sort of socialist community oriented view of family life anyway. So it's my money or it's our money. And she was more individualistic. And that was what I thought the philosophical disagreement was. But no, there was all this stuff going on about my hangups, my privilege, her, so there's all sorts of things going on that eventually, it really took 5 years, led me to understand her more deeply, her to understand me more deeply, and me to think more carefully about how that kind of thing might play out, at other times in my life, that kind of disagreement. So, I know that doesn't specifically answer the question because I don't know what the timeline would be, but it's definitely long. Whatever it is, it's long. Unfortunately.
All right. Well, I at least have to step away at this point. I don't know if you want to stay. I think people are about ready to.
That was a lot.
Yeah, you're probably. Sarah, I should ask you first. You're probably exhausted now. But that was.
No, well, I have a banh mi waiting for me.
Oh, nice.
Which I haven't had a banh mi in 2 years. Is my favorite food. Wow. I'm very excited.
They don't have them in England? What?
No, God, no.
Really?
They probably do in London and the fancy places.
Oh, okay.
But I live in Exeter. They have apples and cheese.
That's all. Well, enjoy it then. This is great. And these are really, what I really loved about your paper is that, these are real real questions. These are real life, right, issues that to think about. So so that was good, and it was good to, you know, to have this conversation. And thank you so much for presenting and doing such a wonderful job engaging with us all. So
Really, I mean, just thank you guys so much. Thank you, all of you. I'm sorry if I seemed evasive, especially Asha too, because this really is a very rough draft. Like I just started, so I'm sorry if I was doing some fancy footwork there, but I really appreciate so deeply all of your comments and your attendance, and just even just to be, you know, able to be introduced to all of you who I admire so much. Like it's just an honor, honestly.
well, good. Well, thank you. And so I'll be in touch with you and Robert. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye.